Hi. Okay, so this week we're going to be spending some time talking about the very basics of computers, knowing the different parts. I'm going to be presenting notes to you in this video, and I'll be creating my document in Microsoft Word. You're welcome to use Microsoft Word on your computer. Most of the students choose to use Google Docs for their notes because with Google Docs you have cloud-based storage. You can pull up your notes on any device, whether it be a smartphone, tablet, computer at home. If you do want to use Google Docs, if you're not familiar with it, all you need to do is in your address bar of your browser, and it does work best in Google Chrome. Just go to docs.google.com. You will need to be logged on to your school account, and when it comes up, just go to blank. Okay. Now I choose to use Microsoft Word just because it gives me a little more flexibility of my sizes and format of the document. Makes it a little easier to see on the screen whether I'm projecting it to you if we're doing our notes live or if I'm doing it in a video. Okay, so this is again computer basics, and we're going to talk about some different terms, and I like to think about it like this. You may have your driver's license and drive a vehicle. Are you a car mechanic? Probably not. Am I? Absolutely not. I could tell you crazy stories of dumb stuff I've done with a vehicle over the years. But everyone, I believe, that drives a vehicle needs to have a basic understanding of where the parts of the car are and what they do. Know where the engine is, know where the gas tank is, know where the radiator is, and so on and so forth, and understand what those different parts do. And that's the exact same philosophy that I have about computers. So the first term that we're going to put into our notes is the term secondary storage. And it's a term that a lot of times gets really easily confused by people. And so I want you to have a good understanding of it. When we talk about secondary storage on a computer, we are just talking about the part of the computer that's going to hold information or data for future use. So that I could actually save my notes today and save them into secondary storage. So when we talk about secondary storage, another way to think about it is that it's permanent storage. It will continue to be there unless you choose to delete it. Another term that we use when we talk about secondary storage is that it's non-volatile. And what that means is that it will still be there after the computer's been turned off and turned back on. That's what non-volatile is. Now, I mentioned that a lot of people get confused by the term secondary storage. That's because most people think of it by this term, the hard drive. So if you have a laptop computer or a desktop computer, it has a hard drive. That's where you store all of your files. If you have a smartphone, you have secondary storage. Maybe it's 16 gigabytes, maybe it's more, but that would be your secondary storage. But we don't call them a hard drive on a smartphone. Okay, so when we're dealing with computers, secondary storage is measured in two different forms of measurement. One is gigabytes. Gigabytes is usually just abbreviated GB. But it can also be measured in terabytes, which we abbreviate TB. The computer that I'm working on right now, I believe, has a 250 gigabyte hard drive. I believe the desktop computer you use in the classroom right now also has a 250 gigabyte hard drive. If you were to go purchase a new laptop or desktop computer today, it would probably have at least a 500 gigabyte hard drive. It may have a 1 terabyte. As time goes by, the storage capacity increases on computing devices. Okay, so we do need to talk a little bit about how a hard drive works or how it's organized. And there are three terms that you need to understand. But first of all, you need to understand that a hard drive is really just a series of platters that are stacked. Just metal platters stacked on top of each other. And within each one, we have some terms. We have what we call a sector, what we call a track, and what we call a cluster. A sector, and a track and a cluster, these are not things that you would actually see if you were looking at the surface of a hard drive. They're magnetically divided this way. So a sector is a cross section of a hard drive. And so what I like to say is it's like a pie slice. A track on a hard drive, these are the grooves. And what they are, they're circles that go from the center to the outside of the drive. If you think about a music CD, not that most people listen to those anymore, everything seems to be all digital, but a music CD has tracks, right? Track 1, track 2, track 3, and they go from one side of the CD to the other side of the CD, or even if you think of like an old-fashioned record, like for a record player, same thing. They would work just like tracks. And then when we talk about a hard drive, we also have a cluster. And a cluster, all that this means is just a group of data that's stored in a sector. So if I save my notes right now to the hard drive, it's going to be stored in a cluster, just a chunk of data all stored on the hard drive. And it can have, depending on the file size, multiple clusters of data. I will be showing you a diagram of how this is organized also. Okay, so that is secondary storage. The next thing that we're going to talk about is what we call primary storage. And again, it's something that a lot of times I hear people confuse, but primary storage, usually the terms that we use for this, we use the word memory. Another common word that we use when we're talking about primary storage is what we call RAM. And RAM just stands for random access memory. Okay, when we are talking about RAM or memory, or just the generic term of primary storage, what it is it's temporary storage for your computer. And instead of being non-volatile, like I mentioned with secondary storage, this is volatile. So if I'm in the middle of working on something and my battery dies on my laptop, I may have lost what I was in the middle of doing. That's because it was stored in memory, not in the hard drive. Okay, so to specify it a little bit more, it's what the computer needs to run programs and to open files. The more memory you have on your computer, the more you can run all at one time. So on a computer, this is always measured in gigabytes. And again, we can just abbreviate gigabytes GB. Okay, and the next thing that I have listed is just the typical size of what you would see on a computer. If you were to buy a computer today, most likely it would come with 4 gigabytes of memory or possibly 8 gigabytes of memory. Now, does that mean that you couldn't have 6 gigs of memory? You could, it's just not as common. 12 gigabytes would be available on a higher end computer that's going to be cost a little bit more money. If you have an older computer, you may have less primary storage capacity. You might have 2 gigabytes instead of 4. But these are the common ones today. Okay, then I am going to stop this for a minute to show you what memory and hard drives both look like. Okay, so what I'm having you look at on the screen right now is what a hard drive would look like. If we were to open up any of the computers in the classroom right now, open up the case and unplug all the different parts, you actually wouldn't see this. It would be covered by a case. And it has to be dust proof because a tiny little speck of dust that gets on the surface of a hard drive can ruin it. But this is what it would look like if we were actually able to pry it open and see what's on the inside. What you'll see here, this would be one of the platters, and inside a hard drive they're stacked on top of each other. And we won't worry too much about what you see over here, but this is what we call an actuator arm, and it works like basically like a needle on an old record player, and it moves across reading the information on the disk. And now I'm going to go to this next diagram, and again, this is just a hard drive, but what you can see here are the 3 platters stacked on top of each other. It depends on the kind of drive. There might be more platters on a larger drive. And then this diagram just kind of shows you what the organization of a platter would look like on a drive. Again, you're not going to see it looking at the hard drive itself. This is all magnetically assigned. But if you can take a look at this slice right here in blue or purple, whatever this color is, this is what we would call a sector. And there are multiple sectors on a platter on a drive, and you can see all the different sectors going around. Just one is highlighted in color. Tracks, like I said before, are the circles or the grooves that go around the platter itself. And so there are several different ones. You can see one that's highlighted here in pink. And then when we store files, whether we're installing a program, saving a document, whatever we might be doing, that data is actually being stored in clusters, which are just like your chunks of data on a drive. And so if you take a look at this diagram, you'll see in green, this is where the clusters would be. But again, they're all over the place on a hard drive. Okay, and again, that's all secondary storage. It's permanent. You put something on there, it's still going to be there tomorrow, the next day, the day after that, unless you actually delete it or something fails with the equipment itself. And then next thing, and the last diagram or illustration that I want to show you, this is what RAM would look like. This is a memory card, and if we were to open up the case of a computer in the lab right now, you would see a couple of these on each computer snapped in to the circuit board, which we call our motherboard. This is RAM on a laptop computer. It's half the size physically. Storage capacity, whether it's 1 gigabyte or 12 gigabytes, whatever it might be, the storage capacity might be different, but the physical size of RAM is the same. Okay, so it's a little longer on a desktop computer, and then obviously smaller so that it can fit inside a laptop. And then with that, we're going to go back to our notes that we're doing and move on to the next term. And the next term is the CPU, and this is actually the most important part of the computer. One of the things you need to know is what CPU stands for, and that is Central Processing Unit. And sometimes people just think of it as the microprocessor. And one of the ways that people like to think of the CPU is that it is the brain of the computer. And its job is to handle all processes and commands. It's not going to actually complete everything and do all the work, but it makes sure that all the work gets done, okay? And it's very similar to the human brain. So I could take my right arm right now, lift it up, and wave my hand to you. My hand and my arm are doing the work, but it's my brain telling it to do so, and that's how the CPU works with all the other components of the computer. And when we get a computer, a CPU is always measured in gigahertz, although back in the day it used to be measured in megahertz. But as computing capacity increased, they went with a larger form of measurement. And when we buy a computer, there are really only two companies that produce the CPUs that we find within a computer. The two big companies are Intel, which you've probably seen Intel commercials before. Intel makes the Core processor. The Core i7 is one of the top of the line processors right now. The personal laptop that I bring to school and work with has a Core i3. It's an older computer. The computer that you're using right now is a dual core processor. It was top of the line back when we got the computers, but that was a long time ago. Another form of processor that Intel's known for is the Pentium processor, and I am going to list more, which is the Celeron processor. So it's kind of like having a vehicle. Say you have like a Chevy or you have Toyota, but you have different models of vehicles. That is exactly what Intel has. The other big company is called AMD, and they are known for the Athlon processor. And another one that they're popular for is the Phenom processor. Each of these companies makes many more than just the ones that I have listed. Intel tends to be more expensive than AMD, so if you were in the market to buy a new computer and you had a very strict budget, you might want to choose one with an AMD processor instead to save some money, because the CPU is the most important, or not only the most important part of the computer, but it is the most expensive component of the computer. Okay, so we've talked about secondary storage, we've talked about primary storage, we've talked about the CPU, and then the next term is the thing that holds it all together, and that's the motherboard. Oops. Not that. That's not the motherboard. There we go. And all the motherboard is it's just a big circuit board. And its job is just to hold all the circuitry and the components of the computer. So any part of the computer is somehow connected to the motherboard, whether it snaps in, whether it's something that plugs in. For example, maybe I have a USB drive, I plug it into a USB port on my computer. Well, if we were to open up the computer and look on the inside, that USB port is connected to the motherboard. And I'm going to pause for a second here so I can show you what a motherboard looks like. Okay, so this isn't really anything special, but this is an example of what a motherboard would look like. This is what would be inside the tower of your desktop computer. A laptop computer would also have a motherboard, although everything would be more condensed to fit inside a laptop. But you can see spots where cards snap in. Everything just connects within this, and the processor, the CPU, you're not going to see it right now, but it would be below this orange part, and everything along the edge here would be things that connect into the computer. This looks to be like a motherboard from a pretty old computer. Now we're going to go back to our notes. So we are going to move on now and talk about storage devices other than your hard drive and your memory on your computer. So first I'm going to go a little old school here and put the term floppy disk, which you may have never seen a floppy disk before, possibly, but I bet if you asked your mom and dad, they had to use floppy disks when they were in school. I had to use floppy disks throughout college, and even teaching here, my students use floppy disks here all the way up until 2009, actually, because we had some really old computers. So when floppy disks came around, the original size was 5¼ inches wide. And I do have one somewhere in the computer lab, so if I can dig one up, I will show it to you. This particular kind was flexible, which is where they got the term floppy. You could actually bend it. That wasn't really a great thing because they could also easily be damaged. As time went by, and that was in like the early 80s, as time went by, the size decreased. So instead of being 5¼ inches wide, it was 3½ inches wide. And what made it different was that other than it being smaller in physical size, it was more durable. It actually had a hard plastic cover to it. You couldn't bend it. And then with floppy disks, the largest size that you could have, and when I say size I mean storage, was 1.44 megabytes. That is so small compared to today's storage devices. So you probably wouldn't even be able to store an entire song, like an MP3 version of a song, probably wouldn't even fit on a floppy disk. And then I'm going to mention another kind to you here, and this is one that you may have never heard of before, and it's called a zip disk. And a zip disk is something that was used in certain areas or certain industries, not a popular thing that people would have at home, but a zip disk looked like a floppy disk. But it was thicker, and it had a larger storage capacity. It could store up to 750 megabytes. We used to use these here at school for certain reasons. Our secretaries at the time, they've both retired now, when they would have to do state reports and send things to Lansing, they would have to put all of their data on a zip disk and send it in the mail. I did yearbook for 1 year, and when we did yearbook that year, we had to put all of our pages, we couldn't submit them over the internet. We had to actually save them on zip disks and send them to the yearbook company. So, like I said, it's not something that people had for using at home, but it was very common in businesses because it had so much storage capacity to it. Here was the drawback to it. Zip disks could only be used on a computer that had a zip drive. And that was not a common thing that people had on their computers. So if you were buying a computer for your house and you wanted to have a zip drive on it, you would actually have to upgrade to be able to have that. So we had a zip drive here for yearbook, and it was an external one that plugged in to the computer. And our secretaries at the time, they did have zip drives on their computer. Okay, so let's talk about something a little more common, and that would be a CD. When CDs came out, they were really a huge improvement over floppy disks and zip disks. They had a storage capacity of 700 megabytes. Okay, so not quite as large as a zip disk. But what was great about them is that they were really easily viewed on computers because computers were coming with CD drives. Now, if you wanted to be able to actually create your own CD, you have to have a CD burner to be able to save files to it. Nowadays, if you have a computer with a CD drive, it would be a CD burner. Back in the day when CDs first came out, again, it was something that wasn't common to have a CD burner with a computer. It was a considerable upgrade price to be able to have that. Okay, so then after CDs, the next thing that came out were DVDs, which we always think of DVDs, when it comes to like movies, renting a movie or something like that, if anyone even does that anymore. DVDs have a storage capacity of 4.7 gigabytes, so this was huge compared to CDs. And this was what we call a single layer DVD. DVDs also come in dual layer capacity, and if they do, they have an 8.5 gigabyte capacity. And then let's talk about one more storage device here that is extremely common, and that would be a USB flash drive. Some people just call them USB drives, some people call them flash drives, some people use the term thumb drive, and we know how those work. It just plugs into a USB port on a computer. And what made it so much better than any of these other storage devices that we're talking about is that they were portable, more durable, lots of storage capacity. You could easily delete things from it and put things on it. And when I say durable, I totally mean it. I've had some, I dropped one time that was outside in the snow for a few weeks. It still worked. I've had one go through the laundry before that still works. It's not something I recommend to try to, mistreat it like that, but they are very, very durable. Okay, I am going to add two more to the list for today, and that is memory cards. Memory cards are things that we don't always think a lot about when we're talking about computers, but we think about when we're dealing with cameras or phones. If you have an Android phone, you have the capability of installing a card inside of it. If you have a digital camera, it would store things on a memory card as well. And so two types of memory cards that I'm going to have you list is just an SD card. That's the larger one. That's what you would see inside a camera. Micro SD card, that's what you would see inside a device like a smartphone. And I'm just going to add here, mostly used for cameras, phones. And the only drawback to this is that you must have a card reader or an adapter to read on the computer. So if you've ever used a micro SD card before, it comes with an adapter and you plug it in and it looks like an SD card that you can fit into an SD slot. The computers in the lab here don't have a card reader on them. The laptops do. So in the lab, what we have is a little USB adapter. It looks like a USB drive. You plug the SD card into it, plug it into the computer, and that's how you access it. Okay, and I'm going to add another one here, which is an external hard drive. And this works like a regular hard drive. But it's portable. It's going to plug into a USB port on a computer. External hard drives are great for backing up your files, so that if something were to go wrong with your computer, you have this other device that you could always restore the files. People that have computers where their hard drive's getting filled up, an external hard drive is great for storing the files to free up some space. And a certain type of hard drive that people sometimes like to get is what's called an SSD. That stands for solid state drive. My external hard drive that I use for my school files is an SSD. And it's not like the type of hard drive that I talked to you about earlier. It's not going to have platters It's not going to have sectors and tracks. It's faster than a standard hard drive, and it has no moving parts. So it's a little more durable. If I had a regular hard drive and dropped it on the floor, I could ruin that hard drive, and I've done that before. If I have an SSD and I drop it on the floor, chances are it won't be damaged. It still could be, but the chances are a lot less. The only negative to an SSD is that it is more expensive than a hard drive, although over the last couple of years the price has come down a lot. Okay, now this is not the end of the notes, but we are getting near the end of the notes, and this is where I'm going to stop for this particular video, and then we'll pick up at a later time. And what you want to do is make sure you have a saved copy of these notes, and you're going to submit them to me on Google Classroom.